Annie's mouth was coated in red. She'd bitten the one of the medic's face so fiercely that most of his right cheek was now an angry red hole. He thrashed away in instant agony, now unable to form words. The other medic stumbled backwards in shock. Annie's right foot was already hooked around her ankle, causing her to fall hard to the ground. It didn't take more than a moment for her to bring the supplemental oxygen tank the medic had been preparing high above her head and down onto the woman's skull. On the second strike, her cries took on a strange, hoarse quality. I imagined a face caved in, struggling to make a passage wide enough to scream. On the third blow, she fell silent. Out of my stupor, I lurched forward and triggered the bedtime protocol. Small apertures in the ceiling began hissing loudly, flooding the room with a scentless, colorless sleep agent. The door to the examination room relocked itself. I dimly heard someone else in the room begin to call for security. Annie stalked the proctor around the room like a lion in a cage. She still held her newly bloodied weapon in her hands, while he did his honest best to keep the bolted-down exam desk between the two of them. "Annie! Stop! Stop!" He pointed the baton towards her, clutching it fiercely in both hands. It was difficult to hear anything over the continued wailing of the medic she'd bitten. Annie must have thought the same thing, because as she paced past him, she brought the oxygen tank into a baseball swing against his temple. It was odd, seeing the way his head didn't split, but instead just dented inwards at an unnaturally severe angle. A blood bruise slowly began to darken the skin around the blow, but it wouldn't for much longer. He'd be dead in a second. Then the hiss of the agent filling the room was the only sound left. 30 seconds. That's how long it would take for the gas to saturate the space. A lot could happen in that time, sure. But given how the proctor managed to keep his distance, I thought he was going to make it. He was much larger than her as well, and could have defended himself long enough from a young woman for them both to lose consciousness. He was following our self-defense training to the letter, which is what killed him in the end. Personnel were not supposed to physically engage Annie, for risk of injuring the miracle of medicine rattling around in her skull. But as his movements became sluggish and uncoordinated, hers remained steady. Security was now posted outside of the examination door, but someone in the division was arguing that they needed to wait for the protocol to kick in. Given the violence, there was a high risk that she'd injure herself resisting. Always avoiding that altercation, their squabble was far away in my mind. I could only study my creation. She was calm, as if this was just another examination. A loud thud broke the tension as he hit the floor. The proctor finally surrendered to the agent. Impossibly, Annie didn't. She loomed over him for a moment, as if curious. The tank was set on the floor with a dull clank as she traded it for the padded baton. Her pale blue eyes cast a sideways glance to the viewing window. To me. Then she set to work. For over a minute, she bludgeoned the helpless proctor. Down came the baton again and again, painting the room, the window, Annie in scarlet. It hadn't been a particularly dangerous tool, meant for self-defense really. Nor was she all that physically strong. I suppose that's why it took so long to reduce his head to the red pool that she did. A new argument had broken out around me about why the sleep agent wasn't taking. Conversation about what to do next began, division members struggling to find consensus. But as I watched Annie's attack, I realized. Her chest wasn't moving, her mouth remained tight-lipped. Finally, in the midst of this crisis, I spoke. "She isn't breathing." She hadn't been since I'd initiated the protocol. All of nearly 3 minutes now, and with such physical activity. How? After a moment, another realization, months too late, dawned on me. The fainting spells, each time increasing in frequency after successful implementation of the protocol. She'd been practicing holding her breath to the point of fainting. At some point, she decided she could long enough. There was no telling how long that was, and I never found out. Dropping the soaked baton, he returned to the tank. Annie fished the oxygen mask out of the medical bag and methodically connected the tubing. "Oh my God!" Someone muttered in disbelief. Some part of me was filled with hideous pride. Placing the mask over her face, she twisted the nozzle to flood herself with fresh oxygen. Still, she took a controlled breath in, as if conserving what she had. It stayed in her hands as she moved over and sat on the desk, cross-legged. Whatever monstrous reasons she had for this tantrum could be dealt with later. But what damage she could do had been done. My helpless colleagues continued to falter. Suddenly, something came over me. Of course this had happened. For too long, I'd left Annie in the care of people who couldn't hope to understand her. We had all agreed that my presence would only prove a distressing distraction. But now only I could fix this. It was our bridge to cross, no one else's. I turned on the observation microphone, and for the first time in over a decade, spoke to her. "Annie, are you finished with your outburst?" No one made a sound. A break from routine. Annie didn't respond. She simply stared back through the window at us, the members of the division. And me. Clever thinking with the air supply. I suppose you've been paying more attention than they've all been giving you credit for. Another pause. Nothing. But we both know it won't last forever. You're going under in the next 10 minutes regardless. Did she even recognize my voice anymore? So, I'd like you to make the most of this moment. Nobody else here is going to listen to you. But I will. The hiss of the apertures. Tell me why you've done this. What do you want, Annie? Her face had taken on a strange, distant quality as I spoke to her. A long silence gripped the division as we awaited something, anything to happen. For a long while, it seemed this would end in an unceremonious standoff. Took me another moment to realize that it wasn't just a faraway look. Annie was in that catatonia of hers, that place of waking consciousness she had long ago replaced sleep with. The man standing next to me was a doctor that had worked with the division for 7 years. I'd had lunch with him yesterday. We joked about our alma mater. I turned to him as he made a burbling, then popping noise. A majority of the blood in his brain was ejecting through his tear ducts. He fell first to the desk, then to the floor, dead. There was a strange crease crossing over his face diagonally, as if some great pressure had pressed the top and bottom half of his head together. A scream, more pained than the rest, rose up in the already scrambling room of white coats. The doctor I'd been speaking to that morning had joined us shortly after the exam began. She was clutching her chest, her face twisted into a confused and tragic expression. With an earthy crack, the front of her clavicle bowed outwards. There was a queer shape to the internal explosion of the wound. As she collapsed, allowing me a different angle to the carnage, I realized what I was looking at. It was the impression of a hand pressing out from inside of her body. Annie was in the room with us. She'd never been asleep. People crashing together, a mad dash to the door. Esteemed academics and medical experts, now clamoring over one another, all pretenses gone. Just a desperation to survive. Rats in a cage. The observation door wouldn't open. If Annie could do this, it wouldn't have been hard to jam a door. Seeing no escape, I pondered all that had happened in my time in the program. A tutor, one of Annie's oldest, began vomiting a mix of bloody bile and intestinal lining. Some of her puzzles began to make more sense to me. One of the division stakeholders, who wanted to personally see how his little investment was coming along today, folded in half until the back of his head touched his ankles. She'd been walking around the facility all along, out of body. A security guard, ex-military, screaming himself raw as Annie churned his insides, displacing his organs, causing him to bulge into a less than human shape. A building thrown against the wall, an explosion of colorful plastic. The newer nurse, one who had immediately been itching for an opportunity to leave the program, had her windpipe eject from the left side of her neck, as if it was a burst pipe. One-way mirrors, a constellation of dead fish, bobbing back and forth. It was over. This facility wasn't as you'd see in movies, equipped with a full military dispatch and body armor. Our single security interest for over a decade had been an adolescent girl. The rampage moved beyond the room I was trapped in, but all was quiet after a few minutes. I sat on the rim of the observation desk, trying to get as little blood on my shoes as possible. For some reason, that mattered to me in that moment. Out of my periphery, I saw a movement in the exam room. Moments later, I heard the soft click of the observation room door. Together at last. Annie stood all of 10 feet away from me, an ocean of red between us. She walked across its surface, staring at me with that inscrutable face of hers. Now she was only a foot from me. It was hard to recognize her as my project, my patient, my daughter, everyone's success. Her voice, for the first time alighting on the air and not through a speaker, reached me. "You asked me what I want." She leaned in, and a wry smile spread across her face for the first time since I turned her into this. What she said next, the answer to my question, she said with all the playfulness of a deeply held inside joke between us. With it, she turned around and left me. Annie disappeared out of the room and then the facility. Somewhere out there, she felt the cold night air of the desert we were stationed in for the first time in her living memory. I wonder how long she took to drink it in. Not too long, of course, since we never found her. I conclude my confession with this. We'd all better be very careful from now on, because I have loosed something more than human upon us. And if she is anything like her father, her final words to me carry a terrible meaning. I want to fix us.